So with that being said, and without any further requests to join, I think we go ahead and get started. Anybody have any questions before we get started? By the way, my name's Stephen Long, as indicated in the little box on your screen. I am the broker in charge at Keller Williams Realty Elite in Winston-Salem. I'm also a real estate instructor with Crew Academy Real Estate, which is a school I own. So I've been doing this a little bit, and I'm also a compliance officer for a couple of other Keller Williamses in the region. So I look at a whole lot of paperwork. So long story short is I'm going to tell you what I like to see on the forms today, and hopefully that'll help you in your practice and making sure that you're protecting your consumers and likewise yourselves. So it looks like we got a couple of people still coming in, but I'm going to go ahead and start a screen share because you're going to need to see what I do. So first, one of the biggest questions or one of the most important things that I want to make sure everybody knows is where to get your forms. I know like in pre-license, like, oh, you need to do this. And then you get out of it and they're like, oh, wait a minute, where do we get this? So you can get your forms in a couple of different locations. In the state of North Carolina, the Realtor Association has contracted with attorneys, and those attorneys have written our contracts for us based on the requirements put forth by the general statutes. So our contracts are in compliance with the statutes and the law and the rules. And while the Real Estate Association does not write them, they have contracted with the attorneys who actually did. So they're very good. They're very bulletproof. If you've ever practiced in another state, our forms are probably a little bit daunting to you because of the amount of information that is in them and how long they are and the number of pages that it takes to actually write an offer or take a buyer or take a listing. But there's a reason for that. There's actually a method to the madness. Every time there's a hole in a transaction where somebody gets sued or there's a complaint filed, the attorneys and the real estate association, they talk, they find a way to draft another paragraph to plug that hole so this doesn't happen again. So obviously the forms have grown. When I started, it was the offer to purchase was 5 pages. I think we have just now crested 15 pages. And there were actually a time where it was just 1 page, not even a full page. That was fun. So we're going to go ahead and get started in sharing my screen with you. I want to share with you how I do it. I am not going to try to lecture you on the best way to get it. I am going to show you that I use zip forms. So if you are not familiar with zip forms, it is a product that is put forth by the Realtor Association to provide us access to all those forms that they have written for you. Let's see, make sure that's good. Y'all seeing my zip forms here?
Yeah.
Is that working? Okay, my little green box went away, so hopefully so. So I've already logged into my zip forms. It just comes to a dashboard. Zip forms is meant to do a lot of things. Likewise, DocuSign. And if you're with Keller Williams, you can access a lot of your forms through DocuSign. To give you a little history on how I have worked with my forms in the past, I've been doing this, like I said, a long time. So zip forms was always a good platform for me to get my forms and write them. I, before DocuSign was even popular, paid for DocuSign to use it for e-signatures only. And I've been using it for probably 10 years just to get signatures. So that was all it was all it did. It would send a signature, it would get date signed. It was great. It did that very well. So I would write my contracts in zip forms and then I would send them to DocuSign for signature. Now with Keller Williams, you get free DocuSign. You also have the ability to fill out your forms in DocuSign and get it signed. So what they're trying to do is make DocuSign an all-inclusive. Forms are here, fill them out here, sign them here, and that's working for the most part. It is still evolving, so it's getting better and better. But this is just the way I've always done it. So this does not have to be the way you have to do it. And Monica is going to come on a little bit later and walk through some of the tech aspects of how to get here, but I just didn't want anybody to be perplexed about why am I in zip forms versus getting into command. That's coming. This part is just to really show you how we write the forms. So without any further ado, let's see if I can get in here to one of my samples. Let's see, I have several. So these are all the contracts I have done over the last little bit. And I think my samples are here somewhere. Maybe it's on that first one. Let's try the sample. 1, 2, 3 main sample. Let's see if that's it. Let's go to documents. Actually, let's just go to the forms. We'll just do that. So I'm going to make sure I'm showing the most current. So I'm going to view my forms. You want to start with the offer to purchase, buyer agency agreement, or listing agreement? Any requests?
Offer to purchase?
Offer to purchase.
Oh, you down with OTP? Yeah, you know me. So we're going to start with offer to purchase. Cool. We can do that one. That's a good one. All right. Offer to purchase and contract. And now notice as I hover over it, it says that's offer to purchase and contract. This one says offer to purchase and contract new construction. This one is the offer to purchase and contract worksheet, which is not necessarily something you would use that often. But then there's also one for vacant land. Most of you on the call today are probably residential brokers. So you're going to live on one of three offers, either the vacant land, if you're selling vacant land, the one that I'm about to show you, which is our normal offer to purchase form 2T, or you may end up at some point using the new construction offer to purchase if you're dealing with a builder that does not have their own contract. So let's start with the offer to purchase and contract form 2T. Now, I would also like to preface this conversation with letting everybody on the call know that if you are ever in a pickle, each of these forms has a guidelines forms also in your form software. So the offer to purchase, buyer agency agreement, listing agreement, they all have a guidelines document that is a paragraph by paragraph breakdown of how best to fill this out. Like, here's what you should put here, here's what you should put there. If you're ever like, hey, I wonder how to fill that out, those guidelines are like the cliff notes of filling out these forms. They are invaluable. And I think that I find that a lot of folks don't even know they exist. If you're just learning your contracts, if this is, I'm writing my first couple of offers, read those guidelines for each of those, and I promise they will make so much more sense to you. Because my metric on whether you can explain your contracts well or not, and this is going to show my age a little bit, but we normally would sit across the table from our client with our forms in front of us, because we would do paper and say, this paragraph is this paragraph is this is where we're doing due diligence, earnest money. And when I can explain all of my forms upside down to a client without having to go, let's see, what does that say? I know I've mastered my forms, because you don't want to sit in front of a client and be like, no, yeah, what does that say? I'm not sure about that, because that does not instill confidence in a client who is trusting you with the most expensive asset in their arsenal of investments. So we want to make sure we know our paperwork as best we can. So that's part of what I'm going to do today. Now, as I've mentioned, we have the guidelines. Those guidelines are going to go a little bit more line item by line item. What I want to do today is really hit the parts that we have to fill in, right? Because you are filling in these blanks. So there are many paragraphs in here that do not have a blank, but you need to read them and understand them. And those guidelines can do a good job of explaining what some of those mean. Likely you have heard the explanation and understand what they mean already, either in pre or post licensing. So it's very likely that you're familiar with them and you just don't know that's where it says it, because you're just focused on filling out the blanks because you want to get paid. And I get that, because we like money. Otherwise, we would be running a nonprofit, and we don't want to run a nonprofit. We want to be a for-profit business. So, and again, right here's your guidelines. If you need it, you can always consult those and fill that out appropriately. All right, so let's start with the offer to purchase and contract. This contract is between buyer and seller, period. No one else, buyer and seller. Anya, you have a question? Did you raise your hand?
Yes, I'm not seeing any movement when you say that there's the guidelines. I hear you saying that, but I don't see any change on the screen.
So did you see me highlight this? Does that work?
All I see is the dashboard.
That's all I see.
I think I moved my screen. Let me stop the screen share to do that again. How's that?
Yep.
Okay,
Yeah, that's good.
I see that.
I have dual monitors, so I think when I drug my screen share over, it messed it up. So there we go. Thank you for that. That would have been an awkward conversation if you couldn't see what I was seeing. Y'all just been looking at me get real excited. So good. Thank you for that, Anya. Appreciate you. So this is our offer. And as I was saying, which probably makes more sense when you can see it, you can always reference just below the title of there. It will say, here's the guidelines. You can see that, and that'll be on your offer to purchase and listing agreement. All right, so let's fill these things out and get you guys paid. Buyer and seller are parties to this contract. Nowhere on here is the brokerage or the firm except for the last page. And that is simply to identify who is a representative of the buyer or the seller in the event we need to contact someone. This is not your contract. You are not a party to it. That is important, because this is between buyer and seller. And no pressure, y'all, but if you screw this up, you're screwing with your buyer or your seller. So we don't want to screw this up. If you mess up your agency agreement, your buyer agency agreement, or your listing agreement, you're just screwing with your own paycheck. That's tolerable. We can deal with that, sacrificing your money. I don't mind spending your money. It's not mine. But this is other people's money. This is a usually 6-figure plus amount of money. And we don't want to screw that up, because when we screw that up, they will be coming for you. So we want to make sure we fill this out. In the event you are filling buyer and seller out, we want to be as comprehensive and detailed as possible. For example, if we are dealing with a married couple, we might put Joe and John Dane, John and Joe. No, that's not right. Jane and Joe. Anyway, married couples, put husband, wife, spouses, whatever you need to put there, because the intention is that we're identifying that the contract, that they have a marital relationship. If it were John Smith and Jane Smith, could they also be brother and sister, taking tenancy in common, right? Totally different situation. So if it's Jane and John Smith and they are married, indicate so. That way everybody knows that they have a marital interest, especially on the seller side, because that lets everybody know we've got a married couple. And we all know that saying in North Carolina, 1 to buy, 2 to sell. If we don't have both the sellers on the contract, we may have an invalid contract. So we'll make sure we get everybody that needs to be signed. Now this section right here is very important. And this is a broker in charge, one of the things I see people skip the most. This property is the legal description of the property. So buyer and seller are contracting to purchase and sell what we're describing in this box. And if we do not describe it adequately in this section, we run the risk of creating an unenforceable contract. So obviously we have street address, 123 Main Street, county, zip. But then I want you to skip here where it says legal description. This legal description should be as detailed as possible. Block, section, deed book, page, plat book and page, PIN number, which is also the parcel identification number. Make sure you are in fact filling that in to the best of your ability, because this, and you might recall, is the reason that you can have a suit for specific performance. So if you remember back to pre-license, if the seller breaches, like, hey man, I decided I don't want to sell. If we have a solid bulletproof contract, then that buyer can say, sorry, seller, you're going to sell it per the terms of our contract. The reason this is important, because if you do not describe it adequately, and there is court case precedents where the broker did not fill out the legal description very well, and the courts determined because it was not adequately describing the exact property to convey, we could not force the suit for specific performance because the legal description was not specific enough for that property. So again, broker did not do a good job. So when I kick back, why don't you have a deed book and page? Because every property has a deed book and page. Stephen, I can't find the deed book and page. Doesn't matter, it's still there. Call the Register of Deeds, get somebody in those public service offices to help you find it. There is a deed, or you don't have a property to sell to begin with, because we are transferring a deed. If there is no deed to transfer, we're doing a whole lot of work for nothing. So be very careful with your legal description. Don't be afraid to use this other box where it says other description. Sometimes you might be selling it's a 25-acre tract, and we're only selling 5 acres of that 25-acre tract, and it hasn't been divided yet. Cool. We're going to do the legal description of that 5 acres, and then we're going to say other description, 5 acres plus or minus in the northwest corner of the legally described property. So we can use that to precisely define what it is we're trying to sell. Don't be afraid to put, you put all this information, house and 3 acres at the corner of Main and Walnut. You can put that in there, no worries. Be as precise there as possible. Next section under paragraph D, this is your purchase price. So essentially the first line is going to be what you fill out. Here's another reason I like zip forms, because if I put $200,000 as the purchase price, and let's say I want to do $1,000 in due diligence and $1,000 in earnest money, you know what I love about it? Whoops, that's $1,000. Too many zeros, Stephen. There we go. It does the math for me. Isn't that great? All my mathophobes in the room, rejoice, rejoice. It will calculate the amount due at closing, because it took out my purchase price minus my due diligence minus my earnest money. Then it's what is actually due at the closing table at the time of close. Now, notice on the due diligence section, this is something I've seen people run into. Due diligence is made payable and delivered to the seller at the effective date. Effective date is the moment we go under contract. So we have the last signature by buyer or seller making it an enforceable contract. Once we have a contract, that is the effective date. So due diligence needs to be delivered at the time we have a contract, which is why we need to prepare our clients that if we're writing an offer and we get it accepted today, how am I going to get my money from you to get to the seller so that we are in compliance with the contract. Earnest money, however, we got a little more leeway because we can obviously deliver it in multiple capacities. And if you check this box, you give yourself 5 days from the effective date to get that earnest money delivered. Now, I would also like to bring your attention to the fact, and it comes up a lot, hey, I haven't received the due diligence. I haven't received the earnest money. We don't have a contract. That is false information. Just because we have not yet delivered or received the due diligence or earnest money does not make or break the contract. If this is signed and executed, it is an enforceable contract. If the seller makes written demand for that due diligence or earnest money, the buyer gets 24 hours to deliver good funds, i.e. certified funds, to keep the contract moving forward, or at that point, the seller can unilaterally terminate. Now, here's another little caveat, quid pro quo with this. If in fact you write this offer, and it happens, I've seen it happen several times, buyer agent writes the offer, seller accepts the offer, we have a contract. The next morning, buyer wakes up and says, this is a bad idea. I would like to terminate my contract. They can do that. 100% okie dokie. They can do that because, oops, I got people trying to get in, I think. Oh, there we go. Sorry. They can do that because if that earnest money and due diligence is not delivered, and this is an important thing to cover here. Sorry if you guys just coming in, I didn't see my waiting room. That's my bad. The earnest money and due diligence, if it is not delivered and the seller makes demand and it's still not delivered, the seller can unilaterally terminate. But here's what that creates. This contract says, I'm going to bring you that money, especially that due diligence, right? So with the moment we went under contract, I owe you due diligence money. Here's the problem. If I don't deliver it per the contract, like, hey, I'm going to terminate my contract, I'm not moving forward, and I'm not bringing you that due diligence. A lot of people think that's okay. No problem, no harm, no foul. It is not okay. That buyer still contractually owes that due diligence to the seller. Now, a lot of people are like, it's not a lot of money. I'm good. We'll just move on to the next contract. We got 15 people waiting to put in another offer. But I think it's important that you guys know that the seller in that event, we have a breach of contract by the buyer. The buyer said they were going to deliver that $1,000 due diligence money per the executed contract. They failed to deliver that due diligence fee. So now they are in breach of contract. Well, our contract is very explicit, and we'll see it in just a few minutes, that the exclusive and sole remedy to a seller in the event of a buyer breach are liquidated damages. The only liquidated damages in our contract are the due diligence, which we know is due. But what you don't know is that it also makes the earnest money liquidated damages to the seller. So let me recap that for you in slow motion. In short, if you go into contract and do not deliver your due diligence as you're supposed to, the seller can sue you for the due diligence and the earnest money, even if you terminated during the due diligence period. Did I sum that up briefly enough? Yeah. So a lot of people are like, earnest money doesn't matter. I get it back. Well, if you put $5,000 in earnest money because you think it doesn't matter, and a $500 in due diligence, and then you didn't deliver your $500 due diligence and terminated your contract, that buyer, that seller can turn around and sue you for the $5,500 that they're owed simply because you didn't deliver the due diligence as you were supposed to. So if you're going to write a contract, make sure you have due diligence fee ready and able to go with an effective date and have provisions made to get earnest money delivered timely as well. Was there any questions on that? That was a lot. Hearing none, we will move on. Guys, you feel free to unmute yourself, raise your hand, chime in. I think I got a chat window around here somewhere. Let me see if I can find that. Oh, there it is. Finally. Sorry, Ashley. I missed that. I thought I was getting some help, but I'm having to watch the windows, so that's my bad. There we go. There comes Kendra. Okay, so we got a few. Man, it's a good class. Good group. I'm excited to have you all. Thank you for coming. This is by way of the SMART group. The other, other realtors that didn't show up either don't know their forms or they're faking it till they make it. You guys are going to look like pros. So I did want to comment on a couple more things. Every page does have an initial. We want to make sure buyer and seller get those initialed. I am not going to read you each paragraph that talks about the earnest money. And again, it goes over the liquidated damages, some of the things I'm telling you in conversation, but I'm not reading to you the paragraphs. Oh, you're good, Monica. I'm sorry. It was my bad. I was not paying attention. I get excited about contracts. So Monica's on here too. She just loves it. She's got to hear this class so many times. She just like, Steven, I had to miss a minute. I want to come back and hear some more contracts. I know, it's exciting. I get excited too. Escrow agent.
And
Now,
don't joke, it is exciting. I love contracts.
I love writing contracts. I love the outcome of contracts. When I get paid, I love a contract.
Some of us love contracts, okay?
Yeah, there's a
Right,
sickness.
Ashley.
Some people love paperwork. It's weird. I don't know how to fix that. But yeah, honestly, we got to have it because most brokers I know are not good at paperwork, which is not uncommon. And so they may need the leverage of someone like an Ashley who loves paperwork, or they need to work really hard to make sure they get this right so we don't get in trouble. Because it does no good to earn all this money and then have to give it right back because you screwed up the contract. Yeah, it sucks. So escrow agent. Escrow agent is the closing attorney typically, but it doesn't have to be. This is just the person who's holding the earnest money. Where is our earnest money going to be held? So if I don't have earnest money, do I have to have an escrow agent? Not necessarily. Is it okay for the listing agent or the buyer agent to hold the earnest money? Well, if they have a trust account and they are in fact an escrow agent, then sure, it just has to go into trust. And that's what we're letting everybody know here is where will this earnest money be held in trust. So if there is no earnest money, you may not want to put that, but typically a lot of us are using the closing attorney now just because we do not need a trust account for our firm. And I would encourage you to do so and just take it directly to its final destination with the closing attorney because they have a trust account where it can live.
And Stephen, can you put TBD in that spot?
Actually, you can put TBD. That's a great question. I do see that sometimes. To be determined, meaning the buyer has not yet determined who they are going to close or where that escrow is going to close or go. Now, if it is due within 5 days, though, I better figure it out because 5 days within contract, I have to write that check. So wherever I'm writing that check to needs to go here. And again, if there's no trust money, there is no escrow agent or doesn't have to be. But in that case, I would definitely do that. And you need to come in and amend that. Change it from TBD to who is holding our escrow money. It is actually a contractual obligation that when we're holding money in trust for someone else, that we tell them where it's at. So we have to
And-
tell them where their money will be safely held.
If there is no earnest money, do we just put NA there?
You can, that's acceptable. And in the event this needs to be changed from TBD or something else, you can certainly do a strike through and initial and date by all parties. Or there's also the agreement to amend contract that has a box that you can check to change the escrow agent. So you can do that as well. So again, this just goes over, the obligations and how earnest money and due diligence work. Hopefully you guys understand that by now. You probably wouldn't have gotten through pre-license if you didn't, or any of your post-licensing courses. So just be comfortable with explaining that to your client that due diligence is non-refundable, earnest money is, depending on when we terminate. And by the way, a buyer can actually terminate the morning of closing. And the only recourse that can come from that is that the due diligence and earnest money is given to the seller. The exclusive and sole remedy in the event of a buyer breach, i.e. termination, whenever, is either due diligence and earnest money or just the due diligence, depending on where we're at. It can be for any reason or no reason. They could wake up on a Sunday and be like, this is a stupid idea. I'm not buying a house. And if they terminate, depending on where we are in our timeline, before the due diligence date here or after the due diligence date, then either the due diligence money is gone or due diligence money and earnest money are being given to the seller. Effective date, as we discussed, was the day it became a contract. Due diligence and due diligence period, you need to harp on this. Some folks and consumers will be like, hey, I've done this a million times. I bought a lot of houses over the years. Great. Have you bought one in the last 10 to 15 years? Because if not, you don't know what due diligence is because it wasn't here in North Carolina until about 10 years ago. So you'll need to explain that to them. The due diligence period is the amount of time that they are buying, and it is a time is of the essence date. Very important. Time is of the essence. 5 o'clock that date is when it expires for them to do any and all inspections that they need to do to feel comfortable moving forward. Settlement and closing are a little bit different, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But let's just assume settlement is the day we're going to close, and that's what's going to go there. So we have our due diligence date here and the date we're going to close here. Notice this does not say time is of the essence. Time is of the essence should be very limited in use in contracts because it's not negotiable. There is no leeway. Due diligence at 5:01 on this day, our due diligence period is over. I say that because if you're on the buy side and you're doing inspections and you have the intentions of sending me a due diligence repair request agreement and you send it at 4:50 on the due diligence day, I'm gonna call you back at 5:01 and say no, because we are past your due diligence. So this should never be a rush date, guys. Make sure you give plenty of time for everything that a buyer needs to get done in conjunction with this purchase, including, but not limited to, their appraisal, their home inspection, their radon inspection, their survey, their anything that their lender may require. All the things that a buyer wants to do in conjunction with buying that house to feel comfortable moving forward needs to be completed prior to 5 o'clock. But we also need to give enough time for the seller to review any requests that we may make and respond appropriately, saying, yes, I'll fix that, or no, not a chance. By the way, another point of clarity, it is called a due diligence repair request, not obligation. So if you're going to ask them to fix something, it is simply an ask. Well, the lender says it has to be fixed. I don't care. You're under contract to buy my house. I don't have to fix it. It's as is, where is in North Carolina. I get so excited when people put that in MLS. As is, where is. Of course it's as is, where is. It's what the contract says. I'm just asking you if you'll fix stuff. You can tell me no, but again, it is an ask. And if I don't like what you're saying, you're like, no, I ain't fixing nothing. Cool. I need to terminate before 5 o'clock on this date. Because if I do not, now my earnest money as a buyer becomes entitled to the seller.
Steven,
Yeah.
if somebody put 30 days after acceptance on the due diligence period, when does that start? And is it business days, calendar days?
Good question. So it is going to be defined by the effective date, which is what we really want to be clear on. And this is why we need to make sure that everyone is very clear on when the effective date is, because it is legally acceptable to put 3 weeks of due diligence beyond, or 3 weeks of due diligence beyond the effective date. Because again, it's starting the effective date. We just have to be able to reference when there was that effective date. So the date that it became a contract, offer, acceptance, communication, signed by everybody, that's our effective date. So it is acceptable to say 3 weeks or 7 days, 21 days, whatever you want to put beyond that date, because we're going to start on the effective date and we're going to count forward 14, 21 days. 5 o'clock on that 21st day would then be your effective date. Best practice is to put an actual date whenever possible, so there is no ambiguity or question of when was the 21st date, yesterday or today. It does actually define it, and it is calendar days. So you do need to make sure you're familiar with that. But anytime you can, use dates. It's much more clear. Our goal as brokers in all of our contracts is to eliminate ambiguity. Anything that could be interpreted or misread or read differently by different parties, we want that gone. We want everybody to be able to read it and get the same decision out of, or same information from it. So that's a good question. Now I want to talk about the settlement closing conversation here, which is an L&M. You might recall this from pre-license a little bit, but L&M, the difference between settlement and closing, we in real life sometimes do what we call a dry closing. We're going to go to the table, we're going to go to the attorney at 4 o'clock on a Friday. Everybody's going to sign settlement statements, closing statements, everything's done at 4 o'clock on Friday. That was our settlement. We are not closed because the closing happens when we are on record. So that means that if we close at 4 o'clock on a Friday, the Register of Deeds is closed. We didn't get that recording done that day, which means we don't have a closing until Monday morning, which is important because it says here, without that being recorded, we don't have possession change. The deed still remains in the seller's name. The buyer does not get possession. No funds are dispersed. No commissions are paid. No proceeds are cut. Nothing happens until it's on record. I used to say, I don't count the check until it's closed. Now I don't count the check until we're on record and it's cleared the bank, because I want to make sure we are recorded, done, and the checks are good. So difference between closing and settlement, and that's important because as a listing agent or a buyer agent, we want to make sure that possession is not given. Don't give out that lot box combo until we are on record. Shouldn't give it out at all if you can help it, but until it's on record, you can't give possession. Jennifer?
Quick question about choosing the settlement date.
Yeah.
As we put those settlement dates out there, if the attorney is not able to complete a settlement on the date that we chose and we have to change that settlement date, how does that affect the contract?
Thank you for asking that, Jennifer. And I brushed over it, but I didn't clarify. This due diligence time is of the essence. Notice that is not in the settlement date, and everybody in the contract needs to be made aware. This is our target date. This is not a drop dead date. This is what we're shooting for. Everybody needs a plan B, especially in the market we're in, because attorneys are booked, things get moved, all sorts of things cause delays in closing. And we'll see it a little bit later in the contract, but this actually, the offer to purchase affords for a 14-day grace period. Meaning if we don't close on this day, as long as the delaying party, whoever is causing that delay, works in good faith to still try to get this thing closed, we're in contract for 14 days and there's nothing anybody can do about it. And believe me, you will get people that are mad. Like, I've got my moving truck sitting in the driveway. What do I do? Well, you should have had a plan B. That's what you should have done. And that's why I'm putting the burden back on you guys to make sure you have that conversation, whether you're on the buy side or the sell side. Those clients need to have a plan B in the event we have a delay in closing. Where are you going to go? You got family? Can you afford a hotel? You going to sleep in your car? Go to Walmart? What are you going to do? We just need a plan. So that's a great, great question. Thank you for that, because that is something I think we tend to overlook. And there's nothing worse than a disgruntled client saying, we didn't close on time.
And that's going to happen coming up with the holidays quite often. You're going to have to know when attorneys are opened and closed, when they're taking vacation. And so because of that 14-day period, if say you can't get a closing until after the holidays, make sure you get an agreement to amend so that 14 days starts over again.
Absolutely. Yeah. Because if we now, and to be fair, the contract does not automatically terminate after day 14. So as long as everyone's moving in good faith, we can still perpetuate that contract. But it does give the seller the unilateral ability to terminate beyond that 14-day period. So if we get day 15 and we're not closing, the seller could actually terminate and move on to the next buyer, but not until then. So yeah, if you can protect yourself and your clients with that extension, and that's one of the addenda that we will talk about shortly. And it does go over that in the contract. That's why I'm not reading you this word for word. I'm just telling you the conversations that you need to have with your clients. Special assessments and proposed assessments. Essentially, this section defines those. Special assessments and proposed and assessment in general means there's money going to be charged to the owner of this property for something. It might be that the HOA is charging money because we have to replace all the decks. It might be that the city is doing an assessment for sidewalks or street lamps or gas lines or whatever else. So that means assessments are going to be charged to this homeowner. The difference between a proposed and a proposed assessment is they're talking about it. It's not been finalized yet. A confirmed assessment is this is happening. And the reason that's important is because a confirmed assessment is going to be the responsibility of the seller at the time of closing. Any proposed assessments, one, are material facts that need to be disclosed to the buyer, but two, they're going to be the buyer's responsibility after closing. So we're going to close on the property. When that assessment comes to fruition, that's your problem. Now, I say all that to say, well, I'll get to we'll talk about that in just a second when we get back to that. Let's talk about fixtures and exclusions really quickly. Fixture, as you guys remember, anything screwed, glued, bolted, or attached to the property that would convey. Now, we didn't think that was a very good definition, so we went so far as to making a very extensive bulleted point that is not comprehensive, but a pretty good list of all the things that the buyer and seller would and expect to be fixtures. So garage door openers, generators, landscape, mirrors, all these things that need to be gone over with buyer and seller. So read them and make sure there's nothing in the house that is expected to stay that will not be there, because these are things that we all expect to stay per the contract, and we wouldn't want anybody to take anything that shouldn't be. This is a new paragraph under C that basically says it's a smart world we live in, so we need to make sure that we are unpairing any smart devices, Alexas, Ring doorbells, security systems, because that's just creepy, man. You don't want to keep those things up and running with people moving in their house. That's just awkward, watching them walk around their house, and don't do that. Unpair them, has to, it's contractual. Also, if there are any fixtures that are bolted, screwed, glued, or attached to the property that will not be going, we're going to identify those in subparagraphs D and E here in just a second. Also, if there are items that are leased, not owned, this is usually in relation to like a gas tank, propane tank, where you get propane from X company and you lease the tank and buy gas from them. that is not something you have the ability to sell. So we need to identify that that is a leased tank and it is not owned by the seller, so it cannot convey. It'll be up to the buyer to get with that service provider to see if they want to continue those services. These are other items that do not convey here. So items that would be excluded would be filled out here. So this would be things, again, fixtures or fixture exceptions, as we refer to it, things that are screwed, glued, bolted, or attached to the house that should stay, but are not. So we would list those out here. And that's very clear about what may be removed. Also goes on to say here that where to go? Any damages to, there it is, any damages done to the house in relation to removing a said fixture is the seller's responsibility to repair. For example, one of the most common issues we run into now are the TVs. Like we bolt our TVs to the wall because we don't do the whole feet thing. I don't even know why they mail them with feet anymore, but we bolt it to the wall. The mount that is on the wall that holds the TV, that thing's bolted, probably big old lag bolts, unless you're just lazy and you wood screwed it, and then it may not hold. I don't recommend that. Bolt that thing up to the house. Either way, if it's coming down, it's doing some damage. That is a fixture. It is attached. Now the TV, not so much. Personal property, TV can be set right off that stand and taken with you. But that mount is a fixture. And if the seller intends to take that fixture with them, we need to identify that here and make sure they fix that wall back. I'm going to tell you, if they're cheap, it's better off just to buy yourself a new one, because no one wants to rehang that because that's awful. And also no one wants to repair that wall because it's going to do some damage. You've seen them lag bolts, they big. This is personal property that shall be transferred. So these are things that are not fixtures. Oftentimes we see refrigerators here, sometimes a washer and dryer here. I will caution you that if you have a buyer who is getting a mortgage and they're getting a loan to purchase this property, be very sparse with this section. If you're like, hey, the bedroom and the bed in the third bedroom with the dresser and the chair in the living room and the 2 bar stools and the refrigerator and the dryer and the washer, blah, blah, blah. The lender's gonna be like, no, man, we ain't mortgaging all this furniture for 30 years. Get that off my contract. So if they want to sell that personal property, I would encourage them to do a bill of sale, treat it more like a yard sale. Buyer can purchase materials, items from the seller. This is not designed for that. If we're going to include things like refrigerator, stove is actually defined as being built in, but you can put it here if you like, or a washer and dryer, you can do that. I would also say be very cautious, because there is a case study where someone put fridge in kitchen. So when buyer closed, there was a fridge in the kitchen, but instead of the stainless steel smart fridge that had the camera and the Amazon built in, there was a mini fridge from the dorm room sitting right there. And guess what? Was there a fridge in the kitchen? Contract met. Be specific. So refrigerator in reference in MLS photos present at the time of showing. If you know you're going to be writing an offer on that house, go ahead and get the make and model off the fridge while you're there. Take a picture of it. Put it right there in the contract. We want the Frigidaire model 3000 present in the day of closing to be left. And you can put that in there. Again, make sure you limit the amount of personal property that's in there. We talked about the buyer's due diligence process. Do any and all due diligence during your due diligence period. Have enough time to give the seller the opportunity to quantify any requests you may be making. But remember, all real estate in North Carolina is sold as is, whereas any due diligence repair requests are simply requests. It does not matter if your seller wants you, or if your lender is requiring us to remove that peeling paint. That's not our problem. That's the buyer's problem. We don't have to do that. You can request it and we'll talk about it, but it is simply a request. And that goes over the buyer's lending qualifications and things. Make sure you talk to your lender to see how much time you need to navigate that loan process to feel comfortable moving past that due diligence date. These are some of the inspections that you can go over with your buyer. If you are not familiar with the professional services disclosure form, you need to be, because that is a cover your butt form, but we kind of built a little bit of it in here saying these are some of the things that a buyer should investigate, including your inspections, reviewing your documents. Make sure you talk about insurance, because they need to verify that they actually can get insurance. We do not want to find out that their lender is going to require flood insurance, because one, that's a material fact that we as brokers should have discovered by this point. But also that can impact whether or not they can qualify for their mortgage, because that can be upwards of $100 a month. If there's an appraisal required, we want to get that done. If a survey needs to be done, we want to get that concluded prior to due diligence so that we can negotiate any issues that might show up on the survey. Check your zoning, flood hazards, utilities, streets, all these things need to be checked and investigated during the buyer's due diligence period. Also goes over repair request. Again, the property is being sold in its current condition, as is, where is. Anything that you're requesting is simply that request. If the buyer damages the property in conjunction with the inspections, the buyer would be expected to repair it. So if they step through the ceiling while they're in the attic, they're going to be patching some drywall in the ceiling. This is an indemnity clause that holds everybody harmless from suing the pants off of everybody. Likewise, we're going to talk about the right to terminate, which says the buyer has the right to terminate at any point in the contract. And I have had buyers who will terminate the morning of contract. And that was a client moving out of state. The husband had already relocated here, went to closing. He signed the closing documents. The seller signed the closing documents. The seller has moved out of her staged house and signed a lease on a new apartment. The wife shows up to sign her portion and says, honey, there's not a chance in hell I'm living here. And she would not sign. And guess what? We didn't have a closing. The only thing that seller got was the earnest money. So when people tell you earnest money doesn't matter, you're right. It doesn't matter until it does. In her case, we had $3,000 of earnest money that she got, which barely covered the cost of her apartment and moving, but we were able to resell it quickly, so it worked out. Again, make sure you're protecting your clients and negotiating due diligence and earnest money. Closing constitutes acceptance. This part is important. You may have heard that before. If you go through the walkthrough with your buyer and the house is not in the condition that you want it to be in, don't close. We have a built-in delayed closing, and this goes back to that settlement date. We have some leeway. If this thing isn't ready, don't close. Just don't close. Delay closing, don't go to it, because if you accept it in its current condition, you are closing and accepting in its current condition. Everybody's like, oh, the stuff survives closing. No, nothing survives closing unless you have a contract or an escrow agreement that says so. So such and such is supposed to be repaired post-closing. Cool. Get an escrow agreement drawn up, have an attorney draft something, say that this supersedes closing. Because per our contract, nothing goes beyond closing. Closing constitutes acceptance. Once it's yours, it's your problem. Also, any of the materials from the seller that are still in the house post-closing don't belong to that seller anymore. So get everything out of there unless you have an agreement otherwise. These are the buyer's representations on how they're going to pay for the house. Either they do or do not need to get a loan. I typically, if they say do not, I like to choose do not and then put cash right here so I can make it really clear to the seller when I'm making an offer. This is a cash purchase. I don't need to do anything else. If that is not the case, then I would remove that and put conventional 30-year fixed. These are intentions, by the way. This is not a contractual obligation. This is the buyer's intents on how they plan to pay for the house. If they're going FHA, or let's say they're going conventional, and then your seller gets real irritated because they're getting an FHA. Well, guess what? They can do that. They can switch their financing through the transaction. It's not great and no one likes it, but they can do it. That's why, again, due diligence and earnest money have relevance. We want to make sure that that due diligence is in accordance with the amount of time that they're going to be off the market. Still, their obligation to get the money they need to pay for it, however they need to get it. And so make sure that they are aware that is an intention, not a contractual obligation. Switching financing does not breach the contract. Other property, if they do or do not need to sell it, if they do need to sell some other property to make this happen, probably not going to win right now because there's multiple offers and there's a lot of offers that don't need to sell right now. But if they do, then you need to fill out the following information that gives them a little bit more information to go off of from the seller's perspective of whether your house is under contract, listed, etc. Property disclosure statements are required. Typically, if you are on the buy side or list side, either one, we should be able to mark that they have received this. If they have not received it, you can certainly mark that box, but know that you're basically giving 3 days of free due diligence to that buyer. Because if you check that I don't yet have it, and I'm supposed to, and we go into contract and you get it to me on day 2, and I'm like, ooh, you said this on the RPODs, on the residential property disclosure. You're like, oh, it's a private road. I don't want this house. I'm rescinding my contract and you're giving me my due diligence and earnest money back. So you got 3 days to figure that out. So I don't like to do that because as a buyer, it's scary because I need to know what I'm getting myself into. And as a seller, I don't want to give any more freebies than I have to. Now it might be exempt, and this is where you would put exempt for foreclosure, for example. So we know that foreclosure is exempt, new construction is exempt, and I don't like how that's spacing. But anyway, you get the point, foreclosure. So then we would put exempt, not necessarily applicable there. Interesting fact, often misconstrued, mineral oil and gas rights is only required for residences. It is actually not a requirement for vacant land. It is not a requirement for commercial properties. It is for a residence, and it is also applicable to new construction. So if someone is moving into a house, period, MOG needs to be done. No, very few exemptions in the MOG. Buyer's obligations, again, make sure that they know they're responsible for those proposed assessments. As we mentioned earlier, buyer, you're going to pay proposed, seller, you're going to pay confirmed. Having those conversations, what to expect there. The seller does want to make some representations, which are going to be in the MLS if you need to get these, as to whether they've owned it 1 year or less. This can be important because it was actually a little bit born out of the, I'll say the recession, I guess, when people were flipping the crap out of houses, because people, if an investor would buy a house, put lipstick on the pig and turn around and put it back on the market in 3 weeks. Well, one, I want to know, how long did you own the house? Have you owned it for a year? Do you know a little bit about it? Have you owned it for hardly nothing at all and you don't know anything? Or you can actually not yet own a property. You can sell a future interest in the property, even though that's less common. So this is a nice representation just to give you flags as a buyer on how long the seller's owned it. Also, if you are doing an FHA mortgage, FHA mortgages have a 90-day hold clause. I can't get an FHA mortgage on a property unless the seller has owned it for at least 90 days. I can't even write a contract on day 91. So that's important for your sellers if they're accepting an offer, especially if they're an investor or otherwise. Also important for your buyers, because we want to make sure that they can, in fact, write a contract on a property that has been, and it does need to be owned for 90 days. You guys know about lead-based paint prior to 1978. We're going to stick that sucker on here. This is where typically I see brokers go wrong. I wish they would eliminate this because it's already been stated 3 times, but it just goes over the assessments. There either are or not any special or confirmed assessments. Some brokers, aside from me, because I'm going to teach you the right way to do it, might try to show you to write this incorrectly. They will tell you to put, there are not any if known seller to pay. That is wrong. It even says in the guidelines of this form that if you were on early, we talked about, that says it has guidelines for all these forms. Don't put that. If there are none, put none. Just put none. Because in doing so, you can actually find yourself practicing law without a license. You can actually find yourself modifying a contract without the intention. Because, for example, if we have a proposed assessment, we've already just said proposed assessments are paid by the buyer, right? Mr. Buyer, you know this. We've been over it 4 pages ago. But now I just wrote in that just kidding, seller's paying it. What did I do? I contradicted the contract. I amended a clause. Just put none. None. There are none. Boom. Nailed it. None. We're good here. And same thing with the seller's confirmed assessments. Of course, we know they're paying those. So, but a lot of brokers were taught, and it was correct at a time, none known if so seller to pay. What has happened though is the contract language has evolved. The way that older, more seasoned brokers have filled it in have not changed. You will probably still see that. I see it on occasion coming through on offers still. If there's an HOA, fill that information out to the best of your ability. Also go over the contract requirements with the seller. Most notably is to being able to provide clear title. In our practices now, it's not uncommon for an attorney to do a title search. And in doing so, they were looking for any issues on title. The reason I say that this might be a good conversation to have with both buyer and sellers, I think it's going to be more relevant that buyers contract with their buyers to do, or with their attorneys to do the title search earlier in the transaction. Like, I want to get the title search done during my due diligence too, just to make sure there's not going to be any issues with me getting title insurance. And likewise, make sure there's no issues with the seller conveying clear title. Because, Mr. Seller, you are expected to be able to convey clear title. If you cannot convey clear title, Mr. Seller, you are going to be in breach, right? We've talked about what happens if the buyer breaches. Buyer's going to lose that due diligence and earnest money. A seller breach is much more severe. So we need to do our homework as listing agents and make sure that the seller can, in fact, sell the property and provide clear title. Because if not, and we're down to the closing day and the seller can't provide clear title, well, guess what? You owe the buyer their due diligence back, their earnest money back, their home inspection, their appraisal, their moving, all these things that they've incurred, you have to set them whole to the original condition they were at before they entered into a contract, because you can't perform on your contract. So that you're going to be writing big checks to make them go away. We don't want you to have to do that. So let's go ahead and make sure that the title is clear. We don't have any outstanding heirs. If it's an estate, we've got all the heirs and all their spouses. If it's a trust, we have the trustee. We need all the appropriate people involved to make sure we can, in fact, convey clear title.
Stephen, in your opinion, would you push to get the title work back before due diligence ends?
I think we should. I really do. I don't. Most attorneys aren't getting it to you until a few days before closing, and that bothers
Yes.
me because that's when they're like, "Hey, we have a problem." I'm like, "Why we just find this out now?"
Exactly. And it's so frustrating because they're like, you have
They've had
people
it for weeks.
stopping saying, we're not going to order title because we don't have everything worked out for due diligence, but it's such an important piece of the entire process. I just, yeah,
I agree
that
with you.
was,
And the buyer, by the way, is the one hiring the attorney. Like the buyer is paying the closing attorney to do this title search. And I'm going to tell you, Mr. Attorney, if I'm hiring you to do it, do the daggone title search. I understand that if I don't close, I probably owe you $150 or so for that title search. That's something I'm willing to do. I'd really like to invest $150 for a title search before I invest $700 in a home inspection to realize that there's a great property that I can't buy. So
and
I know
so
I'm gonna
that
end up
goes
paying it
back to, as agents, we have to inform our buyers in the beginning, because this is not saving them money, it's costing them money in the long run. And yeah, the buyer is paying for it. So if you ever have a listing agent say, we want to hold up title work because we don't want the sellers to pay for seller documents or anything like that, it's a different subject.
Right. And on the buy side, like, again, that's an expenditure. And this is a conversation because they may have and you kind of have to prioritize in what order you do things. And this is not to take a tangent on necessarily practice over forms, but if you're going to do all these inspections and you know that there may be a possibility of it not appraising, I'm probably going to lean on the lender to get me an appraisal done first, because like I want to spend that money to make sure that hurdle is overcome before I go spend the money on the home inspection or the radon or the title, right? If I suspect that we may have title issues, I might say, Mr. Buyer Attorney, I need that title search done before I order my home inspection because I want to make sure we're good and don't run into issues to make this more complicated than it has to be. Yes, I understand it's the seller's responsibility to provide clear title, but it's just a lot easier to get it done earlier rather than later. So I think those are good conversations to have, and there's no right or wrong to any of those, and they're never going to be the same in any transaction. Every transaction is different. But having the ability to speak intelligently about that process and how those things work, I think is what your clients are looking for your direction on doing. I did want to cover on the access to the property. The seller does have to provide the buyer access to do their inspections. Does not mean they have to fix anything they find, but they have to be given the access to do that. One of the biggest issues we have here is that the seller is obligated to provide existing utilities at their cost to make sure I can do my inspection. So if we enter into this contract and there's gas logs, by God, put some gas in there so I can check it. I want to make sure it works. So I want to buy it and it works. And electric is on and water is on. So seller is contractually obligated to make sure those utilities are on for me to do my inspection. Make sure you do have those conversations with your sellers at the listing. We do have to get authorization to disclose their information, which I'll talk about here in just a few minutes.
Even real quick, for access to the property, at what point do you say, seller, this is too much, you're not allowing the buyers access to the property?
Yeah, if the seller's not providing what we would consider reasonable access to the property, we've given you notice, we're making the request, and the seller continues to deny it, then it's likely an opportunity for the buyer to consult with an attorney because the seller is breaching this part of the contract.
Yeah, well, I just had a recent where the seller is teaching homeschool. She only gave us that we could only go, she said, gave us one day to get an inspection in, or said Saturdays, which are of course completely unreasonable based off of how backed up vendors are. So it's like, who determines reasonable access? Because in the seller's mind, she gave us reasonable access, but in the buyer's mind, it's not reasonable.
That's a great question. And anytime you see in any contract the word reasonable, it is open for interpretation. And I do think that that would ultimately come down to an attorney and likely potentially a magistrate or a judge to make what a determination is reasonable. But I do think that's where we have to remind them that you are going to need to provide reasonable access. And at the listing appointment, explain to them they're going to do several inspections, and they're with relevant notice, you're going to have to give that access to them.
Yeah.
Or I'm going to, on the front side, let you know on the buyer side, hey, our access times are going to be limited to Saturdays and Tuesdays. If you can make that work as a part of your access for your inspections, then we can move forward. But I do think those are conversations that need to be had with the seller to make them understand that access is a requirement of the contract. I actually don't like selling houses with people in it. I'm like, get your butt out, go. I'll
Yeah.
sell your house when it's empty.
Well, I got somebody out there on Wednesday, so I'm good.
Nice, well done, well done. Also, just talking about the seller's property, you got to get it out by the date of possession, because when we close, anything left in the house is mine, or the possession of the buyer. In that case, you're going to provide good title, Mr. Seller. If you need if there's any lien agents out there, we're going to settle up with them. We're going to make sure we go over those paragraphs with them. The deed to be made to is here. This is actually a conversation I've had come up recently several times. The deed to be made to can be and often is the buyer, but may not be. If this is a cash purchase, Stephen Long can buy a house and I could deed it to Ashley Robertson. I can put her name right here. I'm buying it. It's her deed. She's going to own it. Sometimes we see where people want to change the name. Like investors are, I'm buying it as Stephen Long, but I want to put it in an LLC. I could actually buy it as Stephen Long and deed it to my LLC. Now, if you have a lender involved, they're not going to love this. Lenders don't love it when we mix this up. They actually are going to be very scrutinizing of who the deed is to be made to. Sometimes if it's one to buy, two to sell, you've heard me say that already today. One buyer, meaning I can buy without my wife. But in North Carolina, if the bank wants to foreclose, they have to have everybody with an interest sign the deed of trust saying you're giving us permission to foreclose. So if I can buy, I can qualify for a mortgage, I can buy it, I can be the only one on the offer, but I can tell you what, my bank is going to make me put her right here saying the deed is to be made to Stephen Long and Krista Long, because they want us to both sign that deed of trust. That deed of trust is us giving the bank permission to automatically foreclose if we do not pay as agreed. So they're going to make us sign that. So it's one to buy unless you're getting a mortgage, and then basically both. Agreement to pay the buyer's expenses. If you're on the seller side, please be clear with this, because they think that when they're paying closing costs, this is their closing cost. This is not their closing cost. This is how much of the buyer's closing costs they are contributing. They are also going to be paying their own closing costs, which, while they're going to be much less on the seller side, they will have commission, they will have deed stamps, they will have prorated taxes and interest. So they're going to have things on their side that are their closing costs. And this is how much of the buyer's closing costs they are also willing to pay. So make sure that they understand that those are two different numbers. So, and the way I explain this is essentially, this is if they're offering you $200,000 and they want $500 or $5,000 in closing costs, Mr. Seller, you're getting $195, because just take that $5,000 off. They're just rolling it into their offer. It's not ever coming to you. So that one's a good conversation to have. Homeowner association. We talked about the assessments and make sure that the opportunities for the breach of seller and buyer responsibilities are gone over. If you're going to do a home warranty, you would indicate that here. Either there is not one, the buyer can get one, or the seller already has one. You would just indicate those here. Paragraph 11 goes over risk of loss. It says if there's actually a fire and we're under contract, the buyer has the option of continuing the contract with the seller's insurance money to rebuild. Not many people know that, but that is an option, which is why the sellers always advise to never, ever, ever cancel your insurance until we're closed. You might want to wait an extra day just in case. Do not cancel that insurance until we are on record. Not Friday at 4 o'clock when we signed, Monday morning when we're on record. That's the time to cancel insurance and not a moment before. Also, any delays in settlements, as we talked about, it's got that 14-day delay built in. And this is important to make sure everybody knows closing is a target, not a drop dead date. It is not time is of the essence. It is our goal. We have 14 days to work with. If you're going to do a buyer possession before or a seller possession after, you would check those boxes here. I'm going to encourage you to have your client to speak with the attorney on this in either capacity, because they're just not a good, safe practice. They're an option. Sometimes they're unavoidable and you can use them, but I do not recommend them. They come with a whole lot of potential pitfalls. So just be cautious with those possessions. There are, I think, 13 pre-populated addenda to the contract that you are allowed to attach. You are not going to use most of them on a regular basis. You will likely sometimes use the additional provisions addendum. FHA is a common one to be used, lead-based paint. Those are the most common that you're going to run into. And it does say here you can add pretty much anything to it, either attorney or party drafted addendum. Who's the parties to this contract? Guess what? It's not you. Don't write it. Buyer or seller can actually draft their own addendum to the contract. You should also advise them don't let them do that, because unless they are attorneys, they're likely not going to draft it appropriately. The reason we want it drafted by an attorney is because it's put in legalese, as I like to call it, meaning that it's bulletproof, written by an attorney. Anybody drafting that in this world of real estate, the drafting party is the one held to a higher standard. So if the buyer writes it and says, hey, I expected da 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 da, and it's not written in legalese and bulletproof, and it becomes contested, then the buyer's going to lose because the buyer wrote it. The court's going to say, hey, buyer, you knew what you were writing. Of course you're right. But the seller, they didn't know because you didn't have it drafted appropriately. So we're letting the seller off the hook from this agreement. So while they can, it's not a good idea. Do not use this form to draft anything yourself. You are not allowed to write anything. If you find yourself writing more than even a sentence, you are probably drafting, and it's worthwhile contracting an attorney. Don't get scared about that, getting an attorney to draft stuff. It's cheap. Most of the time, a closing attorney will do it for next to nothing, usually $150 if it has to be something legitimately drafted. So it's not really expensive, and it's very much worthwhile because $150 now is way better than a breach of contract or big checks later. So advise your clients that if we need to come up with something special, anything that's not covered already, we can get it drafted, check that box, and attach it to the contract. The contract in North Carolina, this one is not assignable. It is not assignable. Whoever the buyer is, whoever the seller is, that's who the contract is with. There is only one exception, and that a 1031 tax exchange. If you have a 1031 tax exchange being used, the 1031 tax exchange company is actually replaced as the buyer because the buyer actually never receives money in a 1031 tax exchange. That's how they're able to avoid the taxes. It never hits their pocket. That is the only time buyer or seller can be changed unilaterally without mutual agreement. Mutual agreement, we can change buyer and seller, but it is not automatically assignable. We talked about who the parties are. There's a right of survivorship. If either party dies, their heirs will actually pick up and continue with the contract just as it is written. We've gone over the entire agreement. There's no hidden deals, nothing under the table. We're going to make sure we conduct the transaction in accordance and give proper notification and execution of all the documents or computation of days on a prorated date basis. Then everybody's going to go down here, sign and date. Now you're going to wonder why in the world do they want the buyer and seller information? I don't want to give my clients information away. You don't have to. You can put your information. The reason we have to have some contact information here is because in the event that the earnest money is disputed, it can be released to the clerk of court by the escrow agent, so they don't have to keep up with it. So if buyer and seller are getting into a nasty gram and they're just going to fight it out about who gets this money, cool. We're just going to send you a notice and let you know we have released that money to the clerk of court. It is now in their escrow account. Don't bug me. When y'all get it worked out, go there. And then if it doesn't ever get worked out, this is where it will eventually escheat to the state so that an attorney or an escrow agent is not having to keep up with it in perpetuity. Please make sure you fill in your information as conclusive as possible. Your firm name, your role in the transaction, your license name, all of this is very helpful for attorneys and for anybody working in the transaction to know who you are and who you're working for and how to contact you. Page 15 is a receipt of monies that we would need to document in your file of where the money went. It can go, for example, due diligence may not go to the listing agent. It might be sent directly to the seller. Well, we're just going to get it here. As long as we have it at its final destination, we don't have to have it going through the listing agent. With that being said, that wraps up our offer to purchase, which was a lot more time spent than I intended, but I hope it was of relevance because that's the most important one. Questions on the offer to purchase before we bump over to try to nail the buyer agency or listing agreement? Yes, no, maybe so? Hearing none. Request, listing agreement or buyer agency?
Listing.
Listing, good call. Listing agreement is probably the next most important, or at least potential for liability. So in this case, we want to do exclusive, right to sell, listing agreement. That's the one. That's the commercial one. We don't want that one. Vacant land, nope, not so much. There it is, 101, exclusive right to sell, listing agreement. Here we go. So as you saw, there are also vacant land versions of it as well, which has the guidelines. And you guys should look into that if you decide to go writing offers on vacant land. And it's not too dissimilar, very much the same terms and contracts, but the form is more appropriately applied to those types of properties. Again, this one does have guidelines, as we've talked about. All three of these forms do have guidelines that you should reference. This is the listing agreement. This is an employment agreement. This is how you get paid. If you don't have a buyer agency agreement and if you don't have a listing agreement, you're not getting paid. You're a very good nonprofit. We want these. This is between your seller and the firm, not you, the firm. You are signing on behalf of the firm. So these are for you and your firm to enter into a listing agreement. This is an important document to make sure you have very, very good conversations about what a seller is getting into when they list their house. So again, I'm going to try to move through this because we're running a little short on time, and I want to make sure we hit as much of this as we can today. You should have already gone over the working real estate agent brochure before you ever get an agency agreement. That has to be reduced to writing before we ever get here for any of these documents. If you haven't done that yet, you should have it signed prior to signing this. All right, the term of the agreement. All of our agency agreements have to have a start and end date. This is one I often see skipped or sometimes botched. I think there's a tech glitch on this at some point. So either we're going to start this listing to the effective date, which means the day we sign it, or it's going to be in the future. So it could be listed with another agent. Yes, that's weird. I can't talk to you. You're listed with another agent. Yes, you can. When a seller solicits you to come list their house because they're not happy with their current agent, you can still come and get this listing agreement signed so that you are the next listing agent. You just can't start until that listing agreement expires, and you would put that date there, and that is when you become their next listing agent. Also, it does have to have an expiration date, all start date and expiration date, because we can't have them listing their house forever. Just as a point of practice, all of my agency agreements have 2 expirations date. You're either expiring with me on June 30th or December 31st, the end. If you listed with me right now, you're probably going to be in agreement until June 30, 2021. Now,
See, I guess when we were in pre-licensing, they were talking about not going to get customers that were already under agreement. I guess I'm confused on why this is acceptable if they're already with someone.
That's a great question, and it's a very commonly confused topic, Anya. Thank you for that. So, one, it is not illegal. I can go knock on every seller's door with a sign. Your sign is in the yard. I can walk up with them and say, hey, you don't need to be listed with Martin. You need to list with me. List with me right now. 100% legal. If you are a realtor, though, it is an ethical violation that will get you in big trouble. Also, not a great way to make friends. So that part is where most of the education is, that's a cardinal sin. You don't do that. You don't solicit the business of another agent. That is an ethical cardinal rule.
But mailing to neighborhoods is not soliciting the business, correct?
Right. Yeah, mass mailings to a group, yes. Now, if you're mass mailing to all the listings in that neighborhood, then that's different. If you're mailing to every house in the neighborhood, 100% okay. That's blanket farming. You're okay there. This, in conjunction to your question, though, Anya, is if the seller is listed, let's say, Jennifer's got a listing right now and they're just not happy. It's just not going well. They want to list with somebody else. I didn't call them. They Googled me. They called me and said, hey, I'm listed with Jennifer, but I want to change agents. I am then allowed to engage in that conversation. They solicited me. I did not solicit them. I can't do anything until Jennifer's listing agreement has either been terminated or expired. And that's what that clause says, is I will be the next agent when this agreement has expired. So that hopefully cleared that up.
Yep, thanks.
Absolutely, good question. Same thing with the property legal description here. As we talked about on the offer to purchase, be as specific and detailed as possible. Also go over the fixture conversations that we also had in the offer to purchase section, and make sure they understand what they need to leave and what they need to have. By the way, garage door openers is a common one. If they don't have garage door openers, they don't have to go out and buy them. If they want to, they can. That'd be nice. But this is saying we're going to give what we have, right? Not that we're guaranteeing you will have garage door openers, even though we've never had them. Also note that the agent and the seller initial and sign this agreement, because this is between you and the seller. Does remind them to unpair their devices. Don't be creeping in on your new buyer. It goes over items leased, not owned, or you have a propane tank or other. What are those fixtures that are screwed, glued, bolted, or attached to the property that you plan on taking with you? By the way, this is an important conversation here. Is it always seems to come back to the hydrangea. There's always a silly hydrangea or a rose bush. And they're like, oh, that hydrangea was at such and such's funeral and I'm taking it with me. Well, that's a fixture, dude. That's rooted to the ground. We do not want the buyer to show up and find that hole there where their beautiful hydrangea used to be. we need to identify that is here. In fact, the conversation we should have with our sellers is if there's anything bolted, screwed, glued, or attached to the property that you plan on taking with you, let's go ahead and get that down before we show the house. Because inevitably that buyer was buying the house because of your stupid hydrangea. And now that you're taking it, the whole deal is going to fall apart because of this bush. Let's just get it out of the equation before we ever get there. So that's the conversation to have with those. Personal property, I like to leave personal property negotiable. I don't throw in fridges, washer and dryers on my listing agreement as an automatic conveyance. But I do have a conversation with my sellers that, hey, are you planning on taking the fridge? Does it matter? They're like, we don't care. Cool. We're going to leave that as a point of negotiation. When they come back and say, we want you to change all the batteries in the smoke detector, we're going to be like, how about we leave you the fridge and you change it? And they're like, cool. And everybody wins. Home warranty, if you're going to include one or not, you can take them on a listing. It typically is a free expense for a seller to put a home warranty on it while it's listed. It is not free once they close because they're going to pay for it at closing. So I'm not a huge fan of home warranties personally. I would encourage you guys to let the home warranty reps wine and dine you because they will buy you lunch and coffee and cookies and all kinds of junk and tell you about their stuff. I'm not going to do that. But if you do that, disclose it here because you can, in fact, receive a small marketing fee that they will refer you. They'll give you a $25, $50, $75 for encouraging your seller to call them about this home warranty. That's where we have to disclose that fee so that we're not getting any kind of illegal kickback. It is being disclosed. Listing price. This is important. This has to be filled in. This is not a TBD because we can't list a house if we don't know the price. So put that there. Also, how the seller will accept financing. If the seller's not going to do seller financing, don't put that. If they're not going to do USDA or they're not eligible, don't do that. If they don't like that FHA VA thing, don't do that. So just check what they are appropriate or agreeable to accept. Now, this is the commission part that a lot of brokers get confused on. This is the total amount of commission that the listing broker will collect. So for the purposes of this discussion, I'm just going to use round numbers because just as you always know, discussion of commissions are always negotiable. I would never be in this atmosphere telling you what you should or should not charge because that would be in a Sherman antitrust violation. We are, in fact, just going to plug in some round numbers for conversational purposes. So let's just say this is a 10% commission. I'm going to collect 10% of the gross sales price for listing your house. I don't get to keep that 10%. I have to share it with brokers who sell it. And I'm going to show you where that goes in just a minute. Now, it might be you're selling a $10,000 piece of land, right? Really small piece of land. 10% of that, not really going to be worth your time, right? It's a very small amount. I might have a minimum fee. So I'm not going to do 10% of the gross sales price. I might say I'm going to do $1,000 minimum. Right? I'm not going to go out and put a sign in the yard for less than $1,000. Because by the way, the price tag is irrelevant. The amount of work that goes into every sale should be the same. Everybody should get the same level of service, assuming you're pricing them all the same. You can have levels of service, but I do think you need to make sure that if you're not going to service all clients the same, then just don't take them. But if you're going to do a flat fee, you can do that here. Also, there is a protection period that goes here. It is meant to protect you as the listing agent, saying if a buyer comes along, wants to buy the house, and then within 60 days later, after I've expired and you've kicked me to the curb because we couldn't sell it and you couldn't agree, if that buyer shows back up, well, clearly they came because I was the procuring cause of the marketing. You would still owe me my commission if you sold it within X number of days. And you can put whatever you can get your sellers to agree, but I usually try to do 30, 60, 90, whatever you think. I also am never going to go back and try to pursue that because if they didn't want to pay me, I'm not going to fight them for it. And I'm a firm believer in karma, and there's way too much social media out there that they would blast me on. But there are bad people that will do bad things for sure. Also making sure that the fee is due and how it's due and the paying off. And we want to make sure we have the ability to transfer the title. If there's any additional compensation that we're going to be collecting, we'll disclose that. We're not going to do that on here. You can amend it here if you want to, but there's also a form for that. You will have your own closing costs, the deed stamps, the commission, and things of that nature. The attorney fees for the seller are going to be much less, and they don't have to use the closing attorney. They can use any attorney they want, but it's for the new deed, the lien waiver, and the lien affidavit, meaning that there's no other liens against the property. So those are the 2 or 3 things that they'll have to have drafted. Some attorneys have that service for less than others. So on the listing side, I usually call the attorney and say, how much do you charge? Call the buyer's attorney and say, how much do you charge to do the seller docs? They'll say X number of dollars. If I don't like that number, I'll go somewhere where I can get it cheaper. but usually I'll try to leave it with the closing attorney just because it is a little more simplistic. This is the part where I tell the seller how much of that 10% commission I will be sharing with buyers. Now, it does say I'll cooperate with subagents, buyer agents, or an attached policy. Unless your firm has an attached policy, you won't be using this. It'll be one of these. I like this one because I'm going to cooperate with buyer agents. Subagents means everybody works for the seller. Well, I'm the one working for the seller. So if I got to help you, help me, help my client, why do I want to pay you? You can actually be a sub-agent of the seller and not work at the listing agent or as the listing firm. So that gets complicated, but some people just do both, and you can do both. It's fine. If you're open to sharing your commission equally with people who don't represent the buyer, meaning the buyer is unrepresented in this transaction, you can do so. But I prefer to share my money with someone who's going to help the buyer navigate the transaction. Because if I got to do both, I might not share my compensation equally. I might have 5% here and I might do 3% there, right? Meaning the difference comes to me. This is all negotiable. You can put whatever you want. Your firm, as your duty to you as the listing agent in your firm, we're going to do our best efforts to find you a buyer, discover any material facts and disclose them. Also make sure that your terms of your offer are explained to you so you know what you're accepting. We are not anything other than real estate brokers. We cannot provide you seller professional information on accounting, taxes, any of that stuff, but I know a guy or gal and I can hook you up with the appropriate professional to have those conversations with you. I am just a mere real estate broker, a ninja and a blazer. I don't wear blazers though, so that's weird. So providing agents listing services, and this is the part I want you guys to harp on this next section. As a real estate broker, specifically in the listing seat, you have a lot of liabilities to discover material facts and disclose them. One of the things that is new in this offer to or this listing agreement is the bold capital letters for non-discriminatory language, and now the seller has to initial this. Fair housing violations are a real and expensive thing, guys, and you can get sucked into this easily and not even know it. If you write a letter in conjunction with an offer to purchase that says, my buyer and their kids love your house and look forward to playing on your playground, please accept our offer, the buyer is in violation of fair housing. The buyer's agent, by allowing it to be presented, is in violation of fair housing. The listing agent, by presenting it, is in violation of fair housing. And if the seller takes it because of that, they are in violation of federal fair housing laws. And I'll say that again, they're federal violations, orange jumpsuit, tens of thousands of dollars in fines types of violations. So we want to have a conversation here that that green is the only color we carry about, right? We're going to find somebody that can buy your house with money, and that's what we're going to take. And so we're going to get the offer that works best for you. We are not going to consider any of these protected classes as a part of your weighing of options when we get those offers. Please initial here saying you agree that. If not, then I'm not going to work with you because I don't look good in orange. I am going to market the house, but I'm only going to market the house with the agreed upon following marketing permission. So you can't even so much as tweet about a house coming to the market unless you have this listing agreement done, because this is the part that gives you permission to tweet about it or put it anywhere else. So we are going to make sure that we have that. If in fact I'm not going to list it today, then if you're a realtor, you're subject to the NAR clear cooperation rule, which now says you have to have a listing in MLS within 1 business day of taking this listing. If for some reason that is not the case and we're not ready to put it in MLS yet, we need to do this. Check this box and say our commencement of marketing date will be next week because we've got to get some painting done. That allows you to get your listing agreement done, but then within 1 business day of the commencement date, you have to have it in MLS to be in accordance with the clear cooperation policy. And there's another option I'll talk to you about that allows you to avoid MLS, but we'll get back to that in a minute. Now, this is the checkbox of all the things you can do. I can put a sign in. I can put open houses out there. I can advertise it on the internet. I can put coming soon. I can do all of these things, but only if they're checked and given permission here. We can put a lockbox on the property. Some buyers or some sellers are going to be skittish of this. Like, I don't want a sign in the yard. I don't want my neighbors to know it's for sale. I got a tenant in it. I don't want the tenant to be freaked out that I'm selling the property. I don't want a lockbox on there. I don't trust those things. These are all things that we need to discuss with them and have permission to do before we do it. Also, the seller needs to acknowledge a few things. They can't give out the lockbox combination for unauthorized use. They are in control of visitors, but they can't really restrict the type of visitors that are there. They do need to make the property available. Also want to make sure that they understand any information we put out there about this property is going to go to a bazillion different websites on the internet, some of which we have control over, some of which we do not. So when they call me, I don't want you to know it's going to go to Zillow. Zillow does what they want to. I don't, as much as I would like to, own Zillow. Therefore, if their information is incorrect on your listing, I promise I will do my best attempts to make them fix it, but I don't have control of that website. So I can't make a change to something I don't own. Just want you to know we do have good systems, tools, and technology to make sure that it syndicates out to the best of our ability. But in some places, it may very well show up incorrectly, in which case we are hopeful the consumers will call me. I will set them straight and sell them your house. Also, they want to make sure they understand that pictures can be taken of their house, so that some people will freak out. Oh, I saw a buyer taking pictures of my house. They can. Also, in your buyer agency agreement, when you're working with them, you need to explain you can take pictures while you're at the house to help you remember the houses you've seen, etc. But they're not to be used for inappropriate purposes. They're not allowed to be, take the pictures or take pictures of people in the house and then post them on the internet. This is for your personal reference. This is not anything else that would constitute unauthorized use of that material. Also, this one is anytime there's a box, pay attention to your boxes. This one's important. No use of any kind of recording device from an audio perspective is allowed. Mr. Seller, you can surveillance your property. You can put surveillance on there. You can video camera people all day long. But the moment you start eavesdropping on their conversations, you're going to be in violation of a federal act. You are interpreting a communication without authorization. Anytime we're going to record communications, we have to have written authorization from those parties saying it's okay to record that conversation. If we don't have that, it is illegal. As you can imagine, listening into the buyer's conversation while they're at your house, seeing your house, does constitute a bit of a problem. Make sure the seller is aware of this and you've gone over that, because you want to be able to absolve yourself of the liability that, hey, I told my seller this was illegal. If they did it, that's on them. Now, I told you there's an option to avoid the MLS, and that's sort of true. So if you check the office exclusive box here, you are allowed to have an office exclusive listing that does not go in MLS. If you go down this road, check with your broker in charge for sure, because there is likely an addendum for your MLS that says, why aren't you putting it in our MLS? We love our MLS. All our houses go in MLS. You can't just not put it in our MLS. Yes, I can. I'm choosing this box because it's exclusive to my office. I will not be marketing it to anyone but the brokers in my office. I don't put it on social media or anywhere else, because it is not in my seller's best interest to put it in MLS. For example, there's a tenant in it and they don't want the tenant to know it's for sale. So they tell me, and they sign a listing agreement saying anybody in your office that comes up with a buyer for this house, you can tell the brokers in your office that I'll sell it for this. But that's the only place you can do it. There's going to be an addendum to this contract from your MLS that is an office exclusive addendum, and you will need to fill that out and include it as an addendum to this contract. It talks about earnest money and due diligence. Also have the seller's representations. Do you carry flood insurance or not? This is not a ability to absolve you from checking if it is in a flood zone. Go to ncfloodmaps.com and see if it's in a flood zone. Just because the seller doesn't carry flood insurance does not mean it's not in a flood zone. Some people own their house free and clear. They don't have to carry flood insurance because they don't have a lender telling them that that's the case. So make sure you do check NC flood maps as both buyer and seller to see if there are any parts of the property in a flood zone that may warrant a conversation about flood insurance. Same thing with synthetic stucco. If they're aware of it, homeowner association, get that information, put that in here as best you can. If there's a termite bond, now termite bond is different than termite treatment. A lot of people say, yeah, we have that sprayed. No, a termite bond is a fee that you pay every year. And if you ever show up with termites, they come out and treat it for free. So if there's a termite bond, identify that and whether or not it's transferable. Also, this is their ownership disclosure that is a required field in MLS as to how long they've owned it. Likewise, give them these daggone samples, people. This is a soapbox for Stephen Long. I get so many of these kickback where they didn't check the box. And like, well, I didn't check the box because I didn't give them the samples. They're free. They're PDFs. Give them the daggone samples. The Real Estate Commission wrote this form. They put that in there so we would give them these stupid samples. Don't be like, nah, I didn't want to give it to them. They're free. Email it to them. Check the box. Pro services disclosure. It's a checklist of all the potential inspections that a seller or buyer may want to do on the property. Mr. Seller, I'm giving you this just for reference. Offer to purchase and contract. You're going to get one. So I just want you to have the opportunity to read it before it is actually a contract in your lap. So here are some materials that if you get tired at night and you can't sleep, you might want to look through these so you're familiar with how the transaction is going to go. Also, if there's any liens, this doesn't have to be precise, but if they have a mortgage, I'm essentially looking to see if we have enough sales price to cover their debts and make sure we're not in a short sale situation. So that's what we're going to go over there. If there's anything else that they may have that would affect the sale of the property by balances, liens, payoffs, housing foundation grants, or anything that might need to be included, we'll put that there. Are you not contemplating bankruptcy? If there is, red flags, check with your broker and charges. Are there any leases on this property? Is there anybody renting it? Because if there's someone renting it and they're in a lease, if we sell the property, the new owner has to honor the written lease. So we need to know about that. If there's an FHA appraisal done in the last 120 days, we need to know about that because a future FHA buyer will be bound by that appraisal. Goes over the special assessments. If you're listing a mobile home, you'll need the VIN, which is a plate somewhere on the mobile that you'll identify that number, and the lender will need that. If there's any fuel tanks that are owned or in ground, above ground, or around the grounds, just put that there and figure out what they are and what they hold and who owns them. Initial date sign. Make sure you go over this part, the seller's duties about getting clear title, giving the proper disclosures. Any restrictive covenants that might be out there, make sure they have the ability to convey the property with a warranty deed. It does specifically say a general warranty deed. So if they bought a foreclosure, they might be providing a special warranty deed. So just verify how that'll be conveyed. And they may not know, honestly, and you can just ask, and if there's any flags, consult with the closing attorney about the potential type of deed to be conveyed. If there's anything else that might prevent them, you would put that there, or things that need to be settled before we close, include that information there. You can ask them, and I do encourage my sellers to get a home inspection before we go on the market. I'm yet to get anybody that really takes me up on that, but it's a very good practice if they can, because it gives you a home inspection that you can provide potential buyers and identifies any material facts, which are fantastic because then you can just disclose that. Also, another sample question and answer on home inspections so that they understand what they're getting themselves into. Give it to them. It's a brochure available as a PDF on the Real Estate Commission's website. This talks about photographs and other materials that you're giving us permission to use those. And that they are yours because you are likely going to pay a photographer to take them. If there's any additional terms and conditions, you would put that there. I mentioned my expiration dates are 2 times a year, right? June 30th or December 31st. That's because I usually included my easy 24-hour easy exit plan, which essentially says, Mr. Buyer, Mr. Seller, if you hate me and you don't want to work with anymore, give me 24 hours to fix the problem. If I can't, you're free to move about the country. I'm not holding you to this agreement, which is why some of the expiration dates and the protection clauses are not that important to me. Because I have found that if I have a disgruntled buyer or seller, it's kind of like holding a cat by your tail. It's not going to go well. So I just assume let them out anyway. And it makes them feel good that I have a 24-hour easy exit plan and I never get any pushback about signing an agreement for those 2 dates of expiration. And the cool part about that is I don't have to worry about who's expiring today. So if you have a lot of buyers, a lot of sellers, I don't have to log into all my accounts every day and see who's going to expire today. If it's not June 30th and it's not December 31st, no one's expiring today. So that's cool. Agency conversation resurfaces both here and your buyer agency agreement. Talked about dual seller buyer agency agreement. They have to initial one of these. They don't get to initial all 3 of these. As a broker in charge, I see that a lot. And most of our offices are large, so dual agency is actually a very good option in most cases for them. So again, explaining how dual agency works, you become a referee, right? We're not able to coach either of you unless you want to authorize designated dual agency, which your office must have a policy on as to who can be the one designating. If you have designated dual agency, then both agents in the transaction restore the ability to coach their clients as if we were at different firms. But if you want designated, they also have to authorize dual. So if they get designated, this line here and this line here will both be initialed. If they want exclusive representation, you need to let them know that's fine. We can do that, but I need to let everybody at my firm know that no one can show your property to a buyer because anybody at my firm bringing a buyer would constitute a dual agency situation. So if you don't want anybody from my firm to show your property, initial here, and I will let them know. That usually kind of makes them a little more aware that dual agency might be a good idea.
Everybody muted.
Mediation in the event that we have a problem. Thank you for that. Mediation in the event we have a problem, everybody's agreeing to go for mediation. Have the conversation about wire fraud with your buyers and sellers. Essentially, don't wire money until you've called and verified where it's going. And make sure you get the proper number to verify it. We don't want to email them. I don't want to touch them. I don't want to see wiring instructions if I can help it. And they need to verify where it's going. This goes over the entire agreement, no hidden deals. And then we sign, date, initial, and fill out your information.
that takes us through the listing agreement. I am running a little bit behind. Monica says I've got another minute. I just want to real quickly go over your buyer agency form before we leave. And it's not that much different than anything we've talked about already. So I will be brief. And then there's also, just so you guys know, a recording of this class. And this class is, of course, being recorded. But there's a recording of this class that we have available where I have actually managed to complete all 3 of them in a 90-minute course. So I did talk really fast. I'm obviously talking fast today and still not getting through it, but I do want to make sure I am able to at least introduce you to a few topics on the buyer agency before we leave, if that's okay with Miss Monica. Hearing no
Sure,
objection.
good to go, sir. Good to go.
Okay, cool. I'll take 2 minutes. Same thing with the agency agreement. This is between the buyer and the firm. So you're going to fill in your buyer seller here. Include your general location where it's going to be so that you're not restricting it to North Carolina. It would be weird to say that you can service Asheville and Oak Island equally, right? You're probably in one marketplace. So identify whatever marketplace it is that you're servicing so that if they wanted to engage in purchasing a property in another part of the state, they're not bound to this agreement. Again, start and end date for those as well. Make sure you do, again, include a beginning and an end date. This does have an option for buyers that may purchase more than one property, so you might have a longer end date, and you can reuse the buyer agency agreement for multiple buyers. Just check that box. Likewise, your compensation, this is not the 10% that we had in the listing agreement. This would be what I expect to represent you as a buyer. So again, all compensation is negotiable. I might put 5% there. So whatever my expected compensation is for my buyer services, I would put that there. You can also include a flat fee or a retainer fee that may be due up front. You would fill those in here. Also on the item 2 is your protection clause, like we talked about in the listing agreement. You can show this property to other buyers. I know that question comes up a lot. I've got 2 buyers. They both want to see the same house. Totally okay. Now, if they both want to write an offer, you're going to talk to your broker in charge. But you can, in fact, show multiple buyers the same property. Our job is, again, fiduciary and all the things that you're already aware of. This is talking about disclosing the buyer's information. This is where we get permission to disclose their information to the attorney so that if there's an event where we have to dispute in earnest money, they can be notified that their earnest money has been moved to the clerk of court. Non-discriminatory language. This one does not require initial, but you're still going to put it right there at the beginning of it. Here's your buyer agent duties. Make sure you know what those are. We are real estate brokers solely, unable to provide you other professional advice. Give them the daggone samples of the question and answer on home inspections, the offer to purchase, and pro services. Please, please, please give them the daggone samples. It's there for a reason, not to skip over checking those boxes. Home warranty, if you're going to do that and you're getting a kickback or any kind of, I don't say kickback is the wrong word. If you're getting a marketing fee, you would disclose that there. Also, confidentiality of offers. All terms of all offers are confidential unless the person making the offer is giving you permission to share that. One thing I will tell you that we are notorious for sharing is, hey, we've got 10 offers. They're all cash. Well, guess what? You just shared a term of an offer without the offering party's permission. So be careful with what you say and how you say it. Additional provisions is where I put my 24-hour easy exit clause. Talks about agency again, dual agency. Please don't brush over that. Take the time to explain agency well to them and allow them to make the appropriate selection, as we just covered in the listing agreement. If you're going to act as a dual agency, meaning here we are acting as a dual agent. So if I am acting as a dual agent, and I mean I as the firm expects to get what? So if the listing agreement, for example, was paying 10% to list and buyer's agent, and now I'm going to be the firm that is listing and buyer's agent, what's the firm's expected commission? Well, 10% would go here because that's how much the firm would expect if we did in fact get both buyer and seller sides. You have the right to mediation. We've gone over the entire agreement. Make sure you're aware that surveillance is a thing. Do not say things in a house that you don't want people to hear, because while it's illegal, they're still probably going to do it. You can take pictures of the property while we're going through it, but it's only for your personal use and should not be in any kind of impermissible or inappropriate usage down the road. Or you could be liable. Again, talk about the wire fraud conversation, sign date, and get all your information on that final page. And with that being said, I am 4.5 minutes over, and I apologize. And Monica Perry has the floor. I hope this was helpful, guys. It was recorded. I know I talk fast, so you can play it back at half speed, and it might be more beneficial that way. Monica.
I am here.
There you are. You had the floor. I give up. I surrender.
Well, we appreciate you, Steve.